Okay, it's gone 6 o'clock, and good evening, everybody, and welcome to the latest in our property management webinars that we do in conjunction with Professor Graham Squires, who is of the property knowledge. And Graham, please correct me if I'm wrong. I think I actually posted somewhere that you're at Canterbury University, but you're not, are you? You're now at Lincoln University. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah, Lincoln University. Been doing property studies for 83 years. I've found that out today. So it's a long-established property.
You've been doing property studies for 83 years. You don't look that old.
I'm looking good for it, aren't I?
So Lincoln University have been doing property.
That's right. Yeah, in Canterbury. Yeah, just outside Christchurch.
Yeah. And so you've recently moved down there. And how have you found the change from being up at Massey University in Palmerston North? You're down at Lincoln. How's it been going down there?
Yeah, good. A lot of people talk to me, oh, it's going to be a bit colder down here. And I suppose it's pretty much fitting the bill. But I think everywhere's been cold of late. But I think the main thing with the weather is that we've had 48 hours worth of rain that would normally come down in a month. So it's been pretty wet here. So I'm not sure whether it's been the same up in the North Island. But yeah, we can certainly see the effects of climate change down here. Yeah, following the narrative of what I was expecting down here. In terms of my job and professor down here, yeah, really enjoying it. It's good move, some nice students, a lot more sort of in-person students. Last week I was presenting to about 150 students in our lecture theatre, so it's nice sort of post-COVID to speak to a lot of students. We've now got over 100 students on our Bachelor of Land and Property Management programme. So property management, obviously, sort of your business as well, David. So it's nice to see students starting off on that post high school journey into tertiary education and starting to think about how this connects to the real world, because property is very applied. So yes, it's going well in terms of where I'm living, enjoying the university. Yeah, all going well.
Good stuff. Well, anyway, we'll crack into this, and I'll just share my screen, and Graham, you can probably just talk us through about what tonight's webinar is about and the work that you've just done on this report around short-term versus long-term.
Yeah, this was a fun piece of research that we drummed up. I think I wanted to call this the Big Short. It's this idea of how long-term rents are having a relationship with short-term rents. And when we say short-term rents, we're talking about Airbnb essentially, or other short-term providers, your book a batch type sort of providers. So here we looked at some of the data from a website called AirDNA that some of your listeners and your clients will be aware of. You can see online there the type of interface that it has. What we did was take a snapshot in Q2 of this year of what we'll call TLA districts, which are basically territorial local authority districts. There's sort of about 70 odd of those in New Zealand. So it's nice to sort of drill down into a smaller scale geography rather than the regional sort of analysis that often happens. So we're looking at a snapshot Q2 this year at that particular geography, and we're starting to look at the long-term renting picture, which the data's available through bond data. It's a well-worn sort of path for research, but we're making comparisons to this short-term data from an AirDNA provider.
So just on AirDNA, Graham, where does AirDNA grab its information from? Is this going to getting data from the likes of Booking.com and Airbnb? Where's it getting the information from?
Yeah, your book a batch, Airbnb type sort of data. The biggest provider is obviously sort of Airbnb, sort of the American import, but New Zealand, being its own island, has sort of got the legacy of the other providers and sort of trying to compete. But AirDNA is sort of extracting from several providers on their site. If you just go on the click on the about, it says where those bits of data come from. I think within our report we've nicely mapped these geographies. I've been learning a lot more about the intricacies of New Zealand geography, places. Kaipara, places in Northland, and so it's interesting to explore these different areas, because Obviously, when we look at short-term rentals, we're looking at the tourist considerations. It's not just all about city and rural, those traditional sort of pieces of analysis. We're starting to explore other areas, and which asks a lot of questions rather than solutions. But I think we're starting to drill a lot deeper into various issues, whether it's affordability, looking at demand, supply, post-COVID issues, how the market's changing, all those sorts of things. I think before we go into our first graph, I thought if we look at number 3, page 3, I think there's a really interesting. There's going to be people who watch this and go, well, what about service charges? What about this, that, and the other? We've just made it clear here. This is how this particular platform talks about its rates and its definitions. So we've got an ADR, which is an average daily rate. So that's, if you went onto Airbnb, it would tell you what the rate is. And then essentially, this is the average booked nightly plus cleaning fees for all days over the last year. So this is sort of the average daily rate. If you averaged it out over the 12 years, that'd be the daily rate. Occupancy rates is what we're looking at as well. Occupancy rates, the number of days divided by the total number of days available for rent over the last 12 months. Properties with no reservations are excluded. And the occupancy rate figure represents the median over the past 12 months. So there's little sort of particularities that we've got to be mindful of when we talk about occupancy rates. We don't have the actual full number of properties, which is sort of, that's the blind part of this. But I'm currently in the midst of getting some more data to look at the dynamics of this, and we'll be able to delve deeper into the actual number rather than just the percentage of what's occupied. So there's little blind spots that we've got, and the revenue is the interesting bit. Looking at long-term revenues, and the interesting bit of the report is that we've looked at long-term rents over a week. And we've matched that to short-term rent over a week. So we're looking at that daily rate, and then sort of extrapolating it to weekly versus weekly. So this revenue piece of short-term rents is the month. The way they take it on their site is the median monthly revenue, which is the nightly rate and cleaning fees earned over the past 12 months. This revenue figure represents the median over the past 12 months and does not include taxes, service fees, or additional guest fees. So there's those sort of particularities. There's also other little nuances that we need to be aware of. One property might have the main residence of the person, and then they might be renting out parts of their property. It might be the shed, it might be a lower downstairs area. So there's sort of little differences that we need to be mindful of, that we're not just comparing apples and oranges here. So that's another sort of an interesting aspect to this. In more broad terms, before we get into the detail, page 4, we're looking at these long-term rents. So this is the bonds. This is what myself and you, David, have been talking about a lot in terms of what the mainstream long-term rental picture is. Then we've looked at in page 5, the short-term occupancy rate. So if you flip onto, this is all the Airbnb data that's coming through. So this is the occupancy rate, the percentages of how long they've been occupied. Then page 6, we're looking at the long-term rents over that weekly. So I talked about, we try to match weeks against each other, so we can look at all these different districts and what what that median weekly rent is, and then compare that to page 7. So this is where we're starting to list out the geographies. Remember, this is all snapshot stuff in a short-term weekly rate, which is quite interesting. That throws up some interesting geographies. And then the last piece sort of is probably where the interesting analysis comes from an investor point of view. And this probably sparks off a lot of conversation, is on page 8, where we look at, what's the variance in these geographies between a long-term rent and a short-term rent? And that throws up completely different geographies at times, because some districts are going to be very favourable for the long-term picture, other districts are going to be more short-term. So I think maybe we sort of start from the start and start to look at some of these figures. I think you wanted to talk about the big picture Queenstown situation. So if you flip back to the first, call it the first page, but the 01 part of the report.
Yeah, so I'll do it from this one. Yeah, I'll do it from this one. So,
perfect.
What I did a while ago was just take a look at the impact of what COVID and the lockdown would have on rents across New Zealand. And really, the only place that we found where we saw a significant impact on rents dropping was Queenstown and the Lakes. And we've got this data from NBIE, the Rents and Bond data. You can download all this information and it shows you what's basically happened. And we've put this into a graph, and you can see where my cursor is here. The big drop round about March 2020, just as the lockdown comes into effect. And of course, you've got all the overseas tourists and whatever, they all go, and all these people have got properties which are sat there in essence vacant, because there's no overseas tourism coming in. Add that into the case that you've got a lot of your overseas workers who are getting on planes to get back home to wherever home may be, and all of a sudden you've got a glut of properties that becomes available in Queenstown. And this probably highlights what a free market does when you've got supply versus demand. And all of a sudden, from having a shortage of property, you go from a big demand, or you go to a big supply, and the demand drops. And with the demand dropping, you can see that this drop in rent, it goes from about close to $600 down to, $450, $460. So a drop of about $140 basically within a week. And then once the lockdown, you can see here, once the lockdown ends, it's starting to go, and it's starting to get back to where you would expect it to be if you look at how the trend line goes. So that highlights the impact that what the short-term market does in a place like Queenstown, which is quite often in the news when you're hearing about the hospitality businesses and the tourism businesses struggling to find staff, and people who are going there working there having to sleep in vans or whatever it may be because they can't find a place to stay. So it certainly does have an impact, Graham.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's a couple of things there, isn't it? You can see that sharp fall, and there's a lot of anecdotal and real evidence where tenants for once in that area were able to sort of negotiate downwards, which was sort of the first time in a very long time. And then the second point being, we can sort of argue here that the market's corrected itself. If you look at the trajectory of the line there, it's pretty much as you would see that line correcting itself as. So, and the anecdotal stroke reality of situation in Queenstown is that we're hitting problems of affordability, and that's whether it's short term, whether it's long term, or whether it's owner occupied. Sort of, there is a real issue that this research sort of shows, and it certainly can be replicated in other tourist areas. We look at New Zealand. What's it? 1 million tourists coming through of a population of 5 million. This certainly going to be very sensitive, and I think that graph also shows that how New Zealand is very market sensitive to what's happening on both demand and supply. Very good.
I mean, just pull it up here on this figure you've got here on was it page 8 where you've got the variance. I mean, this is a huge variance, and so if you go, Queenstown is running at, if we go to, I'll just change this, we're going to the full screen, so just bear with me for a moment.
That's fine.
Okay, so you can see here that Queenstown's running at 83% occupancy, and then you come on the short-term market, and then you come down to the daily rate is over $2,000. You can understand why there is such a shortage of long-term residential rental properties in Queenstown. I mean, is there a case here for state intervention to make sure that there's sufficient long-term properties available, or is it just a case of, well, this is what the market is, this is what the demands are? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think in terms of market intervention, there's clearly a market failure happening here. Economists will talk about market failure, and market failure essentially when you've not got long-term efficiencies in the market. So there's a certain irony that by intervening in the market, there's going to be the ability to create efficiencies again, because there's clearly an overheating market that needs to be dealt with, just as if there was a really extreme cooling of a market that will never correct itself, areas where there'll be demand that's never going to return to its equilibrium point. So yeah, I think there's an argument that by intervening in the market, you can actually make the market more efficient and have a less of a tendency to fail. That's just the nature of housing economics, and the sort of the very interesting element of what housing is as an investment vehicle, as well as a consumption good, as well as a social good. So there's a lot of social considerations here as well, and there's a lot of particularities here. Just picking out the Queenstown example, there's that seasonal effects that you have to cater for. That's very different to other functioning housing markets like your Palmerston Norths or Auckland or your other sort of cities within New Zealand. So there is an argument in these places where there's an overheating, there's an inefficiency to have some sort of intervention, and that can be done on the basis of geography. I mean, we see affordable housing zones, for instance, zoning approach to try and deal with some of this issue. And I think you speak to some of these regulatory issues in the short-term rent, short-term, long-term question that we're exploring here, in terms of short-term lets being excluded from certain regulations. I'm not sure if you wanted to talk to that particular point, David.
Yeah. Well, the short-term, I mean, from what we know, and what we feel is a bit of a trend is that a lot of investors, they don't have to worry about dealings around the Residential Tenancies Act. And I think I've highlighted some of this in the summary. And just to let people know, they're able to download this report. We've got a link there which you'll be able to go on and download this report. And if people want to, they can just email me, david.faulkner@pb.co.nz, and we can make sure they can get the report. But what I've highlighted in this is the benefits for investors in dealing with short term. Well, you don't have to deal with things such as the Tenancy Tribunal, the Residential Tenancies Act. You've got all this healthy homes, which has been imposed on landlords, which isn't a bad thing. I hasten to add that we all want to make sure that tenants have got warm, dry, and safe properties. But because there's more pressure coming on from compliance in terms of what you've got to do to provide long-term accommodation, we're probably seeing that some of the short-term markets is now becoming more and more popular. Also, with recent changes with the Residential Tenancies Act, in terms of you need to have a valid reason to end a tenancy, and in terms of when giving out a holiday home for a couple of weeks, or it may no longer be deemed to be a valid reason. You've got those changes, the challenges there. So you may be seeing some investors now saying, right, let's just deal with the short-term stuff because it's easier. Though in saying that, it is most definitely going to be a lot more labour intensive because of the turnarounds of tenants that you've got or guests that you've got. And also what I've highlighted, Graham, is that it could be a little bit more hard working as well if you've got more and more people going through that property. So, there's certainly a hell of a lot more revenue which will come in if you're running at those occupancy levels which are quite high, but there's got to be a lot more work to take into consideration.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's what you do about it. I just sort of intonated about zoning and sort of having zones. There's also sort of the spectre of, not just rent caps, because that's sort of talking about in the long term sort of rental market, is, well, how long should a short term let be? Is it 14 days? Are those sorts of minimum and maximum sort of times that a house should really be on the market? And I suppose some of the complexities structurally are dealing with the companies that are the interface to provide this, the Airbnb sort of interface, and so responsibility around that. Particularly when we look at places around the world like San Francisco. New Zealand's not on its own here in terms of affordability issues, particularly sort of interests that have to be balanced out between international travellers and domestic people who have got jobs. They're very different employment markets and people that need property for different reasons. But I think this certainly brings out the tourist element that needs to be played into the actual real needs of local communities as well. I think some of the things that sort of jumped out at me was just if we do look at some of the let's look at page 8. Although those variances, I just wanted to sort of illustrate there. If you look at the top geographies there, Queenstown, we've just sort of talked about that. That certainly brings in some of the international components in that particular district. I think what was interesting, number 2 is Ruapehu.
Yeah.
There, that's more of a domestic ski type market, isn't it? And you look at the occupancy rate on some of the previous pages, the occupancy rate is about 47%. I think it's pretty much
it's the bottom one at 47%.
Yeah.
But you've got there, you can see it here at the bottom, along with the Old Podakey, which again is another bit of a touristy region, which surprised me when we looked at this. But then you compare it, Rupehu, it's basically just about got the lowest rents in the country, which you can see that on page 6, and then you go across to page 8, you can see the variance.
Yeah.
So
and similarly, similar nature. There's a Mackenzie district, which is obviously close to my neck of the woods, Lake Tekapo. There's a lot of long-term rents that are going to be. There's not much employment around there, but some of the holiday homes around Lake Tekapo, where sort of supply is limited, people can charge an astronomical rate for people who are going there just on a long weekend or on a holiday, or international tourists traveling through, all those sorts of things. So there's a clear sort of seasonal, domestic, international, local versus tourist type sort of markets that are having to be tried to be catered for in these two types of rental markets. So when you talk about, well, what regulation or what some sort of incentives need to be put in the market, or market intervention needs to be put in, it needs to be catering for these different needs. It's not just, it's trying to find sophisticated tools to try and deal with all these wide range of issues. It's not just one, it's got to be a rent cap, or it's only so many days. There's got to cater for the different nuances in different locations. Hey, while it's in my head, Palmerston North was the other interesting thing that came out of this, wasn't it? Look at page 5. I think second to Queenstown. So these are short-term occupancy rates. Remember, we're not looking at absolute numbers, so that's what we can't really see this in fine detail.
What you're basically saying, there could be 3 properties in Palmerston North which are being used for Airbnb, but they're running at 80%. Obviously, there's going to be more than 3, but it's what it identifies is that there is a market there in Palmerston North, because there could be a shortage of supply, which is leading to the high level of occupancy rates.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's all underneath Queenstown, it's all the cities, isn't it? Where you see Palmerston, Christchurch, Hamilton, Wellington, Invercargill, Nelson, Auckland. So those sort of major cities to a certain degree. But yeah, why Palmerston North is there is a real interesting one, isn't it? I'm sure it's not everyone going to the rugby museum.
No, I'm sure it's not, Graham. But do you think it's potentially it's a corporate market rather than being a tourist market?
You get a lot of conferences and venues, that sort of stuff, maybe.
Yeah, and things like the stock car teen champs, and people will basically, they'll go away for a weekend and maybe put their home on Airbnb.
Yeah,
like that.
Yeah, definitely. That seems right, doesn't it? Because if we look at the page before that, the long-term rent active bonds, you get a feel for each city and sort of what the sort of the rental scene is like. I suppose we need to be mindful here that Auckland, was it 143,000 long-term rent active bonds, and the next one down's 35,000. So it's putting these in their relative scale as well. So when we look at Palmerston, that's 7,000. Relative to other cities that of a different, they're on a different level in terms of the amount of supply. So I think there's a questions around amounts, but I think that's something worth exploring. I mean, I'm sure to take Queenstown off the front of the headlines when we look at short-term rents, there's something happening there, isn't there, that needs to be sort of looked at, in terms of the local market and the more tourist market, or the visitors market is what we're sort of intonating here, isn't it? Really, it's not your big international sort of tourist, but there is certainly a domestic movement and people wanting Airbnbs in Palmerston North. Yeah.
Palmerston North. It is a university city, so it will probably have more bonds or more rental properties in relation to owner-occupied properties, purely because it is a university town. Also, you look down, that's the long-term active rents. If we go and have a look at the short-term occupancy, any other of these towns or regions which kind of caught you by surprise a little bit, or which were heightened?
Look at page 8. Look at these variances again. I think there's certainly Kaipara, which is sort of Northland, isn't it? Northland region, number 5 on that list. You're seeing that it's maybe a tourist thing as people sort of go up the coast there. That there's just not a lot of local employment housing needs for long-term rents potentially, but then we look at the short-term rents, there's going to be people who are needing that, and there's a demand for that. So that was something that came out. I suppose I was just thinking back to the Palmerston North City one on that particular page. There's a low variance. Palmerston North is very the variance and the difference between a long-term rent and a short-term rent is quite small relative to when we talked about Queenstown or other tourist areas. So I think this variance is very much pointing towards tourism, isn't it? I think that's that's. I mean, I know everyone would say, that's of course that's what we're going to spot here, but I think it's bringing out, even that, as obvious as it is, there's lots of different particularities about these places. There's no arguing that there's local needs within these places. There's seasonal needs. There's owner-occupier needs. And this also plays into other service needs as well. So if we start to play around with the sort of affordability of places, is this having some sort of feed-in effect to businesses as well? I suppose sometimes you say, businesses has a pressure on the residential offer that's there in that area, but it's the other way around as well. It's people being located in an area and the ability for businesses to have employees, which is always something that's in the news as well, isn't it?
Oh God, yeah, absolutely. Now, the other thing which I was going to ask Graham is, I'm suspecting that you would see a variance in occupancy levels for different times of the year, and also a variance in the rates. If someone's looking at potentially dabbling in the investment or short term as an investment, what are the key things that you think that they need to take into consideration in dealing with this?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's the precarious nature of short-term rents. It's sort of the bankability of this sort of stuff, and whether that's something really major, like a COVID type sort of situation, that's probably bigger picture stuff. But people have to be mindful of when finances are going to come in and come out, and then to deal with that sort of precarious nature, it's dealing with regulation as well, isn't it, that we started to talk about. So I think people being aware of what the rules of the game are as tenant and as landlord. I think there's both sides of the coin need to be be aware in terms of who's responsible for what. So I think there's a sort of the rules of the game there are going to have to be played out, and knowledge of what's happening in terms of the rules and the RTA that you mentioned, and sort of compliance things. So I think a lot of people have to be mindful that things can quickly change, and certainly in Airbnb worlds, we can see, because the nature of the market's sensitive. We talked about that at the start, and the nature of the short-term rental market is even more sensitive, especially when there's always these disputes and conversations. Suddenly there could be a national conversation where all Airbnb properties need to be X amount of days, or or X amount of money, and that can quite quickly sort of change the picture. So I suppose people need to be mindful of regulation and sort of policy change, I suppose. Being precarious nature and being flexible, I suppose, is where I was going to with that.
There's one of the things that I wanted to highlight, and why I brought up this section of the Residential Tenancies Act, and this is where it talks about when the Act is excluded in certain cases. And sometimes I've felt that we've seen evidence of people who've used Airbnb as a way to get around the RTA. As such, and in here it states that when a property is excluded, it talks about you cannot let it for less than 28 days. It's highlighted here. So when it falls into that 28 days and more, then I'm of the opinion, if it's the principal place of where somebody is staying, then it almost becomes a tenancy, because you've got, I think, the next section talks about short fixed term tenancies, or tenancies of a fixed term nature, and it talks about for a length of period not more than 90 days. So I look at it, if it falls between 28 and 90 days, then it becomes a Residential Tenancies Act applies. When it's less than 28 days, then it can be deemed to be then you look at it, it's a short term Airbnb model. Anything else, Graham, that you think that we've that you found in the research that you've done?
No, I think it's just going to be, I think you sort of alluded to the idea of the dynamic nature of this. This is a snapshot in time, Q2. think now that well, world's opening up and New Zealand's opening up, I think we're going to see these sorts of sensitivities that we talk about changing. So I think it's being aware of how the market changes, as well as just sort of seeing the geographies and those sort of tourist areas. So I think that's, to me, the sort of takeaway points of this. Really, it's interesting how this is played out in certain geographies. Different geographies have different pressures. I suppose we need to be mindful of reception areas as well, or areas where people might be arriving in New Zealand as tourists, or as starting a new life in New Zealand, where there's going to be certain housing needs, whether people wanting short-term lets for that particular function in their life cycle. So I suppose the point being, it, as I said at the start, it raises a lot of questions, but very good questions, and I think it's starting to illustrate that there's a lot of particularities that we can investigate here. And I think the sophisticated response to this needs to be as equal to the sophistication of all these questions that we're starting to ask. It's not going to be, all right, just a blanket rental sort of cap, whether that's long term or short term. I think is something that people will be thinking about regarding this. So other than that, I think just more study around the numbers.
Yeah.
The numbers is going to be really interesting.
It would be good. Yeah, it would be good to get to see how many numbers, and if you're doing research on that, Graham, it'd be great to know actually how many Airbnb properties that there are in New Zealand, and also I suppose the quality of them as well. My view would be they're probably of a better quality as a gut feel. Though you may get all types of markets as well, some not so high quality.
Yeah, it's feedback, and it's the visibility and the accountability of feedback, isn't it? You go on Airbnb, you're instantly going to be told that somewhere's not good, and as a landlord, you're going to have to be on your toes to change that, and apologize and be flexible in your making sure that the offer's available to the next person. That the next person's going to be interested in buying it. So I think that visibility is and accountability might even be more available in a short-term let, even though the precarious nature of the market is different. So I think that's a nice trade-off, isn't it, when we think about sort of feedback, comfort in knowing that the property is what it says it is, balancing out that nature of, well, clearly you're going to get a lot more for your money in a shorter term, but that short-term nature of thing means it's more volatile, and that's what people who move into this market need to be mindful of, as well as that regulatory sort of aspect.
Yeah.
That's good. Interesting.
All right. So Graham, just to finish off, big thanks for the work that you've done on this. If people want to get a copy of the report, we'll be able to send a link around that they can click on. We can download the actual report. They can email myself, david.faulkner@pb.co.nz. And thanks a lot for the work, and we'll speak again soon.
Yeah, sounds great. I'll stick this on my website as well. Property knowledge. Yeah, no problem at all. See you on the next. All right. Thank you.
Great. Cheers. Bye.